Thank you very much for joining the 6th IIEA panel. Super topical, sanctions and the Iranian economy. As always, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I'm so happy to be able to bring to you 3 excellent speakers and 1 excellent chair. So you don't want to hear me talk. I'm just going to hand over straight to Fatih, who I'm sure everybody knows, founding member of the IIEA. Over to you, Fatih Jun.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamyer. Welcome to the monthly IIEA webinar series. My name is Fatemeh Moghadam, and I will chair this session on sanctions and the Iranian economy. The session is complementary to and an update of the keynote webinar address by Professor Hashem Pesaran given in August 2021. Of course, much has happened since then, and this is, of course, obviously a highly topical subject, which addresses possible interlinks between the ongoing JCPOA discussions with the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. We have we are very fortunate to have three speakers with an intimate familiarity and knowledge of the subject, and really real familiarity with the intricacy of all these developments that are taking place. The first speaker is Javad Salehi Esfahani, followed by Esfandiar Batmanghelic, and followed by Iman Nasseri. Okay. Javad Salehi Esfahani is a highly accomplished economist, and we are very fortunate to have him. He received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. He is currently professor of economics at Virginia and the Kuwait Foundation Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. He has taught or been a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, at the University of Oxford, the Brookings Institution, and Harvard Kennedy School. He has served as a board member on various academic institutions, including IIEA. He currently serves as the associate editor of the Middle East Development Journal. He has co-authored 2 books and numerous articles in major journals. In today's presentation, he will examine survey data on living standards and employment in Iran in the aftermath of the US sanctions. He will measure real household expenditures and poverty rates to assess the impact of sanctions on household welfare and employment. Without any further ado, I'll pass on the microphone to Javad.
Javad Jun, I think you're on mute.
Okay, found the button. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Fatih, for the introduction. I want to correct a couple of things from the old bio. For example, I'm no longer the associate editor of the Middle East Journal, and my association with Brookings also ended at the end of 21. And I also wanted to, this is not what I want. Okay, so I wanted to introduce the overall project out of which these talks are coming. at the Johns Hopkins SAIS, School of Advanced and International Studies in Washington, D.C., organized a project on Iran sanctions. Six authors wrote on economic issues, and not everyone, not all of the authors were available for this presentation. Indeed, there wouldn't be enough time to have 6 authors. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the macro stuff to introduce the Sanctions Project, and then I'll go to looking at the other topics. If you're interested in these papers, I've put the link in here on rethinkingiran.com, and then you will see all the papers there. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit first of all, I will not try to go through the paper, the 60-page paper in detail. I will try to convey the main issues that I covered there. And something that I didn't cover in that paper, but I'm going to talk about here, is how do we identify the impact of sanctions? And then I'll talk about household welfare and poverty, and then move to a discussion of employment and what I call the reverse Dutch disease. Just in case I'm a little over time, let me first start with the main findings. I'm going to argue that identification of sanctions impact is difficult because convincing evidence on secondary variation, which is looking at treated versus untreated, is not really available. However, the effect of a large negative external shock is quite predictable. When you lose oil income, you're going to have decline in living standards and rising poverty, and the distribution of impact is going to be uneven. I'll show a little bit of that. And in terms of employment, the impact is a little bit different from what people expected. And I tried to come up with an explanation of why employment did not fall. In fact, rose slightly, especially in manufacturing. And these are obviously the effect of drastic real depreciation that followed the sanctions. And in the end, I think the message is that US sanctions policy did not achieve its main purpose, which was to get the government of Iran either to change or to change its behavior. Instead, there was a lot of pressure on ordinary Iranians, which continues, by the way, as we speak, but it failed to change Iranian government policy. So, identification of impact is the first topic. The timing of the big slowdown, and just show you what I mean by the big slowdown. First of all, Iranian economy was growing. If you look at the World Bank WTI database using their PPP 2011, not the 2017 variation, which looks bizarre, you see that these 3 economies were growing at about the same rate. In fact, they have similar sizes. Turkey and Saudi Arabia are the 2 large economies neighboring Iran, very close to Iran. And something happens around 2010, 2011. Turkey continues to grow. Growth in Saudi Arabia kind of slows down. Iran's GDP actually declines. If you look on the right side graph, this is the same story told from the perspective of the Penwell tables, which have different way of adjusting for relative prices around the world. And you see here again, the 3 economies are growing at kind of different rates. But then after 2010, the Penwell tables data shows Iran's GDP declining faster than WDI. It shows Saudi Arabia continuing to increase. Why is it increasing? Because oil prices are very high. So oil prices already, you can see, are not an explanation for why Iran's GDP begins to decline right after 2010. Oil prices decline in 2014. That's when Saudi GDP begins to decline. And Turkey, which is not an oil exporter, is not affected by these shocks. Its GDP keeps growing. So is this a good counterfactual for Iran, or these two countries they are in some sense, yes, because as I said, for example, you see that the oil price decline, which is a factor people sometimes mention as the reason why Iran's GDP slowed down. By the way, the more Iranians who make up these other excuses for why Iranian GDP has been slow in the last 10 years, because this issue has become very political in Iran. And it wasn't COVID either, because COVID came in 2020. And other factors that people mention all the time, corruption, mismanagement, which are endemic factors, did not change, or there's no evidence that changed drastically in 2010. So that's all I want to say about this issue of timing. If you wanted to do a more methodical investigation of causal impact, you might be tempted to look at the synthetic control method of Abadei and colleagues. And I'm not a big fan of these because we do have two studies, Qomi 2021 and Karagozli 2017, basically take a bunch of countries instead of just taking like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. They take a bunch of countries. Karagozli also takes Iran's lagged GDP. So it's one of those things that you don't know what's going on. But in the end, both show that there is a gap between the synthetic Iran and the actual Iran. And of course, in their case, they don't identify the timing. Timing is an input to this methodology. And I did a little bit of work with this methodology. I find it fairly fragile. You change the countries, you change the variables you're using, and the results change. But what doesn't change is that after 2010, something happened in Iran that hasn't quite happened in similar countries. So what has happened to ordinary Iranians? You know, luckily, Iran has a lot of very good data on living standards. It's one of the few countries that collects expenditure surveys every year. But I'm going to start with the view of the living standards from the macro data. These are central bank data, macro data. These are GDP per capita. Non-oil GDP per capita is in red, and it's obviously lower. A couple of things you see here that are important. First of all, the macro data also shows a big slowdown in living standards. It also shows that the gap between the GDP and non-oil GDP shrunk almost by half. And these are the 2 points that I'm going to be looking at more closely with micro data. But when you look at the micro data, you notice this is real expenditures per person per day in 2020 prices. And they're coming from individual surveys. About 1.5 million households would be used to get these graphs. I show expenditure per capita for 3 regions: Tehran, urban areas, and rural areas. And you can see here something interesting. First of all, overall expenditure fell. Unlike in the GDP graph, where things were flat, living standards declined. That means the government sector probably protected itself better than the non-public sector. And here you see those closer to the public sector, which would be people who reside in Tehran, did relatively better. This is pretty much like what you see in the GDP per capita. Smaller urban areas and rural areas fared quite a bit worse. This summary result is that living standards in Iran in 2020 were about the same as they were in 2000, 20 years before that. If you're interested in living standards of social classes defined by income level, here's a picture coming from the same survey data, supplemented by survey data from before the revolution. What you really want to look at is this big change after the revolution, where the middle class grows to about 60% of the population, but then flattens and then declines. So this is the impact of sanctions that people talk about having erased the middle class. Of course, no such thing has happened. The middle class has other characteristics like education and family size and so on. So its income declines, but doesn't really drop away from the middle class, speaking in terms of a social class. But income classes, yes, they are closer to the lower middle class, and poverty has risen, and also the rich have suffered, very sad. And these are the cutoff points for the poor. I use the $5.50 that the World Bank uses. This is in PPP data. Lower middle class is less than $10, middle class is less than 50, and upper middle class over 50. The Iranian rich don't really show up in these surveys, so I only have upper middle class. Now, zeroing in on the poor, looking at the same poverty line, you see Iran was fairly successful in lowering poverty from the war years, around 40% to down to 10%. But then it has increased. It has increased in all three areas, but more drastically in rural areas. And that is what we also saw in terms of the average living standards in rural areas. Inequality has interestingly increased. If you look at the numbers that come from extremes, like the Palmer ratio, the ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 40% has been increasing. The ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 90% has been increasing. We don't know what the mechanism is here, but a lot of people also claim that sanctions have hurt the poor more. In some sense, this is showing the same thing. Moving on to sanctions and restructuring, here I'm looking at this, what I call the reverse Dutch disease. You know, what Dutch disease is about is that living standards diverge drastically from productivity. And when that happens, tradable sectors suffer because they're very linked to productivity and they can't compete outside, they can't compete inside. So imports dominate the consumption pattern of the households, but living standards is increasing. And when you have sanctions, the reverse happens. By the way, I should add here that the two sanctions cases that we are observing right now, Iran and Russia, are kind of extreme cases. These are countries that export oil, and oil exporting countries is very susceptible to sanctions. The reason is that if you are a non-oil exporting country, to be very roughly speaking, all you lose from sanctions are gains from trade, right? The productivity is lower, incomes are lower when you cannot trade. But if you are talking about oil countries, then you lose a chunk of the living standards right away. And so we are observing now in the case of Iran and soon in the case of Russia, fairly large declines in living standards because their oil income that's supporting that living standard has been cut. Now, the mechanism is through the exchange rate. When you have sanctions, the exchange rate collapses. People, for various reasons, want to buy foreign currency. Obama sanctions caused this rise in the real exchange rate. Here, I'm correcting the free market exchange rate by the rate of inflation. This kind of inflation kind of subsides after a while, so the real exchange rate declined. This is a time for Iranian manufacturing to do well, competing with outside producers. Then things get worse for them. And then comes Trump in a way to the rescue, and the exchange rate rises, and then again declines. This is a kind of a pattern that happens in Iran very frequently. There is a very popular, strong support for having a strong real or lower dollar, something that obviously producers don't like. And then COVID hits, it has its own shock, supply shock. But again, you see the real exchange rate is declining. So this mechanism is obviously favoring domestic production. So where do we see that? We see that first in terms of relative prices. If you look at the relative prices of tradable goods, Statistical Center has a category called Kala and then Khadamat. I'm dividing these two price indices. You see that Obama sanctions favor tradables. And then again, Trump sanctions favor tradables. And this is what has been happening lately. So what do all these things do? Well, they help non-oil GDP stay more flat, closer to the oil GDP. It also helps employment. And this is kind of my last slide. And what you want to look at is basically on this red line, about 25% of the population kind of lives off industry, and employment is very sticky in Iranian manufacturing in most sectors, but particularly in manufacturing, the government tries very hard to negotiate with producers to persuade them not to lay off workers, sometimes with loans, grants, and so on. But there are also other reasons. I think the reverse Dutch disease is working slightly here. We have anecdotal evidence, and I think we might hear more from Yar about how manufacturing has done relatively well relative to other sectors by even increasing employment after Trump sanctions here. But in general, about 100,000 or so jobs have been added in manufacturing every year. I'm going to end with putting the same slide at the beginning on main findings. And basically, we have the negative effect on living standards and poverty, and we have a slightly positive effect on employment because once oil disappears or shrinks, other sectors flourish. And the final conclusion is that there's been a lot of pressure on ordinary Iranians without US achieving its objective. And as we speak, there are negotiations going on to try to end sanctions. We will see how that proceeds. I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. Passing it to you, Fatih.
Yeah, thank you very much, Javad, for a very informative presentation. The next speaker is, the next paper is entitled Sanctions and Changes in the Composition of Iranian Trade. It is by Esfandiar Batmanghelidj. He is the founder and CEO of the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation, a think tank focused on advancing economic diplomacy, economic development, and economic justice in the Middle East and Central Asia with a focus on Iran. He is also a visiting fellow in the Middle East and North African program in the European Council of International Relations. Esfandiar is a graduate of Columbia University. He has published in peer-reviewed journals on Iranian political economy, social history, and public health, as well as commentary on Iranian politics and economics. He is principal member of a research project on the humanitarian impact of sanctions hosted by the Graduate Institute in Geneva and funded by the Swiss Network for International Studies. In his papers, Esfandiar analyzes the trade data, then in a very interesting and enticing way approach, he asks the question of whether the Iranian political rhetoric of resistance to sanctions implies global isolation of the Iranian economy or its intricate adjustments in a novel way to the global economy. So without any further ado, I pass on the microphone to Yar, please.
Thank you, Fatemeh John. Hopefully you can see my screen. Can you see the presentation I've shared?
Perfect, perfect.
Okay, great. So it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to sort of be speaking in front of the IIEA. It's also always a lot of fun to follow Javad in a presentation because in some ways I think Javad's way of thinking about Iran's experience under sanctions is the most cohesive and kind of illuminating way of piecing together the different household, firm level, and just generally macroeconomic impacts that take place. But I'm going to focus on one element of that story, which is really what happened to Iran's trade relationships under sanctions. And as Fatemeh mentioned, the kind of argument of my paper is this idea that the conventional wisdom is that Iran responded to sanctions pressure really since 2008 by closing itself off from the global economy. That not only did sanctions isolate Iran, but that there was a policy decision on the part of Iranians' leadership to actually retool the economy to be basically more autarkic. And we hear this often because of the political language that's used to describe Iran's response to sanctions and this idea of a resistance economy. But in this paper, which was kind of fun to look back at because a lot has happened in the last few years since I've written this, but I do think it holds up. And it also, I think, has some lessons for what might happen in the case of Russia, which we will talk about. But in this paper, basically, I look at trade data for Iran's exports and imports with key trade partners to try and trace changes in two things, what I call geographic complexity and product complexity. So who Iran is doing trade with and what that trade is composed of. Now, the focus on trade is very much about basically Iran's manufacturing sector. And I think this is where it connects to Javad's presentation and the research that he has done. Also, I'd point to a paper that's within the SICE series of papers, the Rethinking Iran papers that Javad mentioned, by Hadi Esfahani, which looks at the experience of the manufacturing sector in more detail. And the reason I look at trade through this lens of industrial goods is that ultimately this is what matters for Iran's economy. If we know from, for example, the data that Javad presented, that the manufacturing sector as a large portion of non-oil GDP shows a surprising amount of resilience in the face of sanctions, then we have to understand what the inputs and outputs are that are allowing that resilience to take place. And Javad mentioned one of the very important things, which is that manufacturers can take advantage of the devaluation of the rial to enjoy from greater competitiveness for their goods in export markets. And also the devaluation makes imports less competitive in terms of domestic consumption. But beyond that, there's also this question of what Iran needs to import in order to keep the factories running. So those are the industrial goods that go into the production of anything from consumer goods to consumer durables, and then also sort of the raw materials. And so here you have three pictures that I think provide a little description of why this matters. You know, you have basically the elements of Iranian household consumption. You have the sofre and the food that you need to put on the table for a family. And in the background, you have the automobile, which is sort of the pinnacle of Iran's manufacturing sector. And what you realize is that Iranian living standards are, to a large extent, explained by the ability to purchase and afford these kinds of goods. But related to that is the idea that these goods need to be available in the market and the manufacturing sector needs to be able to produce them. So in order to look at the relationship of trade and how it was impacted by sanctions, I went through a simple intellectual exercise to think about the types of countries that Iran trades with and whether they are insensitive or sensitive to sanctions. And this is the sort of typology from the report. You'll see that countries that Iran engages with in regional trade are generally insensitive because of the way that trade is conducted. It's over land, it's pretty sort of informal. It's done by kind of import-export companies that are relatively small in scale. Then you have the countries in the middle, which are essentially non-Western countries, but large economies where Iran is dependent particularly on certain kinds of products in terms of the trade relationship. So you have Argentina and Brazil, from which Iran has historically sourced a lot of its cereals and soybeans. You have China and India. China is an industrial supplier, but it's also obviously the most important consumer of Iranian oil. India is historically a major consumer of Iranian oil and a supplier of products like rice. And then you have other sort of more kind of West Asian regional markets like Russia, Turkey, and the UAE that I took into consideration. And finally, in the column on the right, you have the highly sensitive countries. These are countries that show significant willingness to come on board with multilateral sanctions or to abide by US unilateral sanctions. So you have the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Switzerland. Now, what we find, and these charts are taken from the paper, is that there's basically a kind of compensation that takes place when sanctions are imposed on a country like Iran. In the blue and yellow lines, you'll see that sanctions have a very clear impact right around the time that Javad was describing in his research, right around 2011. You have this impact where suddenly the total value of trade with those countries declines. In this case, we're looking at exports. And at the bottom, you have the insensitive countries which don't show responsiveness. So this kind of substantiates that the typology that I came up with is something that works to understand or to predict what will happen to the trade flows. But beyond these absolute values, what's actually more interesting is what happens in the growth in trade. And here the picture is quite different. Again, the red line is the countries with which are insensitive to sanctions. So Afghanistan, Iraq are the two main ones in that category. And what you'll see is that Iran's exports in this period to those countries grow significantly. And it has to do with the fact that basically the devaluation makes Iranian products cheaper for these countries. And Iranian manufacturers begin to prioritize basically the sales opportunity that lies just over the border. You also see that from a growth standpoint, there is obviously a decline in the trade with the somewhat sensitive countries that are not kind of directly aligned with the multilateral or unilateral sanctions campaigns, but those drops are smaller, which is what we would expect when compared to the highly sensitive countries. This chart's a little bit difficult to read because it was a full page in the paper, but here's the picture on imports. And I think here's actually where I would say the real challenges for Iran's economy under sanctions. Overwhelmingly, we tend to talk about sanctions impacts in terms of declining export revenue, principally because we're looking at the idea that Iran's oil exports are basically taken out of the market. And I'm sure that Iman will talk about that and why that happens. But also the idea that Iran's non-oil exports can't reach some of the most significant markets, and that's really where the pressure comes for Iran's economy, both from a fiscal standpoint, because the government revenue declines, and also from a kind of balance of payment standpoint, because you end up with this import dependence. But the import picture is actually, I think, a more sort of useful way of understanding what happens to a country like Iran with a significant manufacturing base under sanctions. What you'll see here is that Iran manages to compensate in imports for the decline in imports from the highly sensitive countries by growing imports from the somewhat sensitive countries. And of course, the insensitive countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, they're not a major source of imports because they don't really produce anything that Iran needs for its economy. But what's happening with this switch from the highly sensitive to the somewhat sensitive is really two things. One is that it represents Iran sort of this idea that it turned east, so became more dependent on, for example, industrial imports from China, which were previously primarily sourced from Europe. That's a shift that happens around 2010, 2011. And there's this additional phenomenon of re-export. So Iran is continuing to source European industrial goods or Japanese industrial goods but they're not coming directly from Europe or Japan. They're coming indirectly, perhaps bought sort of secondhand or re-exported through countries like Turkey and the UAE. So these next two charts aren't in the paper, but I thought I would share them because I think they're a good illustration of what we're talking about when we look at this idea that Iran needs to continue to import certain categories of goods to keep its factories running. So this is an illustration of Chinese exports to Iran. This is actually data from the Chinese Customs Administration. And the two blue sections at the bottom relate to Chapter 84 and Chapter 85 of the Harmonized System. And basically, these are industrial goods. So it's in Chapter 84, it's boilers, pumps, furnaces, turbines, anything you might need to sort of keep an industrial process going. And in Chapter 85, it's the things that will keep an assembly line going or might go into certain consumer durables like electrical equipment, motors, fuses, and so forth. And you can see that part of the reason why Iran probably weathered sanctions better than some people expected is that although there was a major drop in Chinese exports to Iran generally, and in fact, China has not kind of saved Iran from the sanctions pressure, as some people have suggested, there is a certain level of resilience in the Iranian import of key industrial goods. The picture, when we look at the same data for the European Union, is a lot worse, basically. So this is data, again, from 2018. So here we're actually seeing the impact of the Trump sanctions. The first paper I showed was primarily focused on the impact of the sanctions beginning under Obama. But the same phenomenon applies in both cases. You have this situation where suddenly European exports of industrial goods to Iran, the same two categories we saw in the previous chart, drop dramatically. And here, there isn't the same kind of relative resilience that we see when we looked at the Chinese data. And this is something that the manufacturing sector in Iran essentially needed to compensate for. And the way it does compensate is, on one hand, it delays the kinds of investments or purchases that might grow, let's say, industrial output, or it works extra hard and often at greater cost to source the kinds of materials through third countries in order to maintain output in ways that allow it to take advantage of the kind of structural changes that Javad was talking about with regards to the ability of the Iranian manufacturing sector to export. So there's a couple more charts that I want to show to sort of illustrate this, but one way to kind of demonstrate the role of the manufacturing sector in driving Iran's economic recovery. And I would point out that actually this phenomenon is something that the economists at the World Bank in their latest economic update for Iran pointed to, this idea that the manufacturing sector was really leading Iran's economic recovery after the 2018 sanctions and the COVID pandemic. This is Purchasing Managers Index data. It's something that is compiled by the Tehran Chamber of Commerce, and it's a really important resource. And basically, what you'll see is that the dark blue line is the PMI for Iran's manufacturing sector since October 2018 till today. And when the PMI is above 50, it means that the sector is in expansion. And you can see that it basically, for most of this period, the manufacturing sector has had volatile experiences, but nonetheless has shown an ability to expand. The light blue line underneath is the PMI for the whole economy. And you can see that that recovery took a longer time, but basically the manufacturing sector led the way. But if we drill down into the manufacturing sector, what we see is basically a substantiation of the idea that imports are really the crucial thing that determines whether or not the manufacturing sector in Iran is doing well under sanctions. And we can see that by looking at the key sub-indices that go into PMI. So PMI is basically a survey. You ask companies how they're doing in terms of their orders, their outputs, their employment, things of that nature, and you get a composite score, but you can also look at the different pieces. And here, what you'll see is that the dark blue line is basically the average of the main indices for output, new orders, employment, and supplier deliveries. And then in red, we have this other index, which is really important, the sub-index for raw materials inventory. And you can see that consistently, that has been the laggard when it comes to Iran's manufacturing sector's performance. The thing that companies are struggling with is maintaining inventories of the parts and intermediate goods that they need to keep their output up. And related to that is the cost of securing those inventories, basically the price of raw materials and intermediate goods going up, which is just also related to some of the pressures on imports and generally the inflationary environment in Iran. And so taken together, what this tells us is that the real adjustment that took place in Iran, of course, we know that non-oil exports have grown to compensate in some ways for the loss in oil export revenue. We know that the manufacturing sector has found resilience because it's supplying a domestic market that has relatively inelastic demand for a lot of the things that Iranian manufacturers produce, like food products and basic consumer goods. But the main thing that has been a challenge for Iran's manufacturing sector is not taking advantage of those new opportunities, but putting themselves in a position to do so by having the resources on hand from an input standpoint to keep the manufacturing production up. And that ultimately comes down to some of the pressures related to sanctions on the imports of industrial goods from key partners, for example, China and Europe. So to conclude, the kind of lessons of this paper are that Iran responded to sanctions not by cutting itself off from the global economy, but actually worked doubly hard to maintain its connections to global suppliers in order to take advantage of those structural opportunities related to devaluation and sort of the composition of demand in Iran. And what we see is that the complexity or the range of partners that Iran is trading with and the types of products that Iran is buying and then selling basically increases in this period, despite what we might expect, which is that Iran would close off and kind of go into an autarkic economic model. Now, what's interesting for me about this is that actually I think this is part of the reason why when it comes to things like the nuclear deal and the lifting of sanctions, that remains very appealing for Iran. It's because the resilience that Iran has found is based on actually a model in which the manufacturing sector is even more important for Iran's economy than it was before. And so this relates to Javad's point about the narrowing of the non-oil economy and the oil economy in terms of their contributions to GDP. And actually, it's the non-oil economy that in some ways, from a long-term standpoint, is most dependent on sort of opening itself to the global economy in order to reach its full development potential. And then finally, just as something for us to mull over, but not to go into great detail about, I think one of the interesting questions is, how will Russia fare faced with a similar set of pressures to Iran? I think in many respects, Russia and Iran, as Javad mentioned, are going to go through sanctions in a similar way because they're both major energy exporters. But the other key commonality is that they both have large domestic manufacturing bases. So the size of Iran's manufacturing sector as a percentage of GDP in 2012, when the sanctions were being tightened, was, I think, around 13%. And I believe that Russia, the size of the manufacturing sector as a percentage of GDP last year was 14%. So there's a similar kind of role compositionally for the manufacturing sector in both economies. You have large domestic consumer bases. You have a devaluation of the currency that's taking place. So my guess would be that Russia doesn't necessarily follow the path that we might expect, where it closes itself off from the global economy, but rather tries to shift its trade relations, principally moving away from a mutual dependence with Europe towards a greater dependence with China and with other kind of Eurasian trade partners as its response. And as a result, it's very possible that Russia will demonstrate the same resilience as Iran. And then again, to Jawad's point, that raises questions about the efficacy of our sanctions policy. We know that the Russian people will suffer in the face of sanctions. There will be significant diminishment of their economic well-being. We do not know, and probably should not expect, that the Russian economy at large will collapse because of sanctions. At least that's what the case of Iran tells us. So Fatemeh Jan, I will leave it there, but I hope that was of interest.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. The next speaker is Iman Nasseri. Looking at the important oil and gas sector, Dr. Iman Nasseri will present a paper on what did US sanctions do to Iran's energy sector and what is the outlook given possible scenarios. Iman is currently managing director at FGE based in Dubai. He is primarily focused on downstream oil and gas and works closely with the refining team. Additionally, he works with the global gas team based in Singapore to manage clients. He is also responsible for Middle East oil research. Thus, he has a deep knowledge and practical hands-on experience on the regional and global markets. This is combined with his academic background that provides the technical and theoretical tools to tackle the subject. Iman has a PhD in economics with focus on energy economics, combined with MA and BA degrees that are in energy systems engineering and electrical engineering. Today, he will share with us his practical findings and exploratory speculations. I will pass on the microphone to Iman, please.
Thank you so much, Fatemeh Jan, and thanks IIEA for inviting me as a speaker on this very distinguished panel of speakers. A pleasure to be with you for the first time as a speaker. I've listened to several other very interesting ones in the past, and I hope my contribution to this panel will be close to Jawad's and Isfandiar's in terms of interesting presentation and findings. However, I have to say that, as Fatemeh mentioned, I have been more on the industry side than academic for the past several years of my association with FGE, and hence this presentation is more of an applied economics and more practical findings and basically facts and figures of what has happened on Iran's oil and gas sector, focusing mainly on oil, and what we expect basically to happen given possible scenarios on the table. However, this presentation and a lot of forecasting that we have done in the past several months, especially over the past year or so since the JCPOA talks have been ongoing, did not certainly anticipate and incorporate the current situation that's going on in the oil market, in the energy world, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine has two big implications on the outlook on Iran's basically energy sector, and starting with the JCPOA. So I'll talk more of basically practical aspects of oil sanction and what's going to happen. So basically, starting with oil exports, to tie it back to basically Jawad and Spandier's presentation, which is the trade aspect of economy. As we show here, up in the withdrawal of the US from JCPOA, Iran's total oil exports of over 3 million barrels per day significantly dropped, which was then followed by a period of 6-month waivers issued by the US for certain traditional buyers to wind down their imports from Iran without being hurt significantly, basically to find alternative markets, and which basically was phased out in May 2019, after which the Trump maximum pressure policy, as you see, basically kept Iran's total oil exports down to less than 1 million barrels per day. Now, this is all of these, as I've mentioned, are FGE data. So this is FGE estimates. These are not official, or it can be different from anyone's own calculations or estimations. So please note that these numbers are subjective to FGE's assessment and estimates. As shown here, however, one of the big elements of helping Iran to survive during this Trump maximum pressure period was the fact that they could bring online the Persian Gulf Star refinery, a very, very crucial element of standing against this maximum pressure on exports, or cut on total oil condensate products export period, because otherwise Iran basically could not export as much product as you see here, which exceeded at some point it basically it was near 800,000 barrels per day, which is significant, but also more importantly allowed Iran to get rid of a surplus condensate, which is a byproduct that comes with natural gas. If Iran could not dispose the amount of condensate that comes from the gas field, from the massive, huge South Pars gas field, they had to shut down that gas field, or basically cut the production of gas significantly. That had major implications on industrial activities, major implication for power sector, and basically the outages that the Iranians experienced during certain periods of high demand season, the latest of which was last summer. And also basically they had a lot less revenue, directly or indirectly, and whether or not they can repatriate that income back to the country is a separate matter. But regardless, they could pay for some of those goods, services, and the trade that Esfandiar showed on his presentation to the likes of China, or the regional trade with Turkey, with Iraq. All of those were made possible partially by this amount of products exports out of Iran. So that was a very, very crucial element, and that explains why Iran's policy has changed significantly, and was basically the policy against expanding the oil production capacity and building more refineries were heavily supported and advertised during the Trump sanction period, by the fact that if we didn't have Persian Gulf Star, we could not stand, and we had to go through a lot tougher, if ever, surviving this 2 to 3 year period. I have to say that even with the Persian Gulf Star, they had significant amount of condensate surplus left and unable to place in the market, that they had to shut down several industries at certain period of high gas demand load during the winter. The petrochemical industry was underutilized during the entire time, and still is underutilized. Steel and cement and heavy energy intensive industries have always been subject to output curtailment when and if they did not have enough natural gas to supply them. However, as this chart presents, after the US election and Biden administration taking the office, Iran was able to increase its oil exports from less than 1 million barrels per day by about 50% to roughly 1.5 million barrels per day. And that has retained rather consistently during the course of Biden administration so far. That was mainly through China buying more crude and more players being able to take the risk. And reportedly or supposedly, Biden administration basically putting less pressure on the participants of this gray market for Iranian crude oil. But there seems to have been, again, a threshold, a limit of how much of those barrels could be placed into the market. Roughly, Iran has been exporting 700 to 800 KBD on average during this period of crude oil, combined with another 700 KBD of products, make it to 1.5. Now, what we expected since basically Biden took the office, we always expected they will resume talking about bringing JCPOA back, but we never believed that it will happen during the Rouhani administration. There were many reasons why you could reject that scenario to a certain degree of certainty, and it didn't happen. Now, what we expected is that after the new administration takes the office, within 3 to 4 months, perhaps by fourth quarter of last year, we'll get a deal on the table. That also didn't happen because of various forms of miscalculation in our forecasting in terms of how Iranian negotiators and the US side will react to each other. But it was certainly basically a good call for us to say that after a few months, realizing that no, it's not possible, and pushing it back to the end of first quarter this year. Now, it was close to be signed and to be reached before the whole Russia situation happened, and now Russia has kind of hijacked all of that negotiation by putting more requests on the table, perhaps purposefully and wanting to take away the relief that Iranian oil coming back to the market would give the oil market and to potential sanctions that they could put on Russia. If we believe, and again, I haven't adjusted our presentation, our forecast. We haven't yet, even internally for FGE and our clients, we have not yet changed our base case because we don't know exactly what's going to happen within the next week or two, which is very, very, very crucial in both the developments of sanctions against Russia, as well as developments of the JCPOA talks in Vienna, which I think within this week or next, both of them will be a lot more clearer in terms of positions countries take in those two contexts. Now, if we believe that they could find a way to go around a rather impossible request by Russia to contribute and participate in the revival of the JCPOA, then a deal will be signed, which will in practice allow the market to resume taking Iranian oil from sometime in second quarter, and then a ramp up will follow in mainly crude and condensate space, because Iran is already exporting nearly all the products that they produce at the refineries for reasons that is outside the scope of this audience. So that's basically what we expect. Now, I have a few slides. So what happens if this scenario fails? That scenario is shown in basically red here in terms of total exports of Iran, doubling or nearly doubling from 1.5 million to 3 million by within the next 6 months. What happens if that fails? Well, if that fails, there are two scenarios of a no deal, and that no deal could be business as usual. So basically the US keep the same amount of pressure and the same market remains for Iran to sell their oil. Stronger sanction enforcing and going back to Trump maximum policy would have been even a more likely scenario in terms of no deal if there wasn't a Russia situation. But as you see, because of the sanctions on Russia, US is looking at various options, including one being talking to Venezuela yesterday and working on removing the sanctions on Venezuelan oil to come back to the US. The alternative scenarios are basically one is full removal of sanctions. Now, what does that mean? In our base case, we never expected, or we didn't expect before, again, pre-Russia Ukraine situation, we did not expect a deal to include full lifting of Iranian sanctions or US sanctions on Iranian oil. Again, we had our own reasons why that is probably not going to be the case. But in our base case, we only kept a cap on crude exports. Now, again, with the current state of market, it is likely that the situation works for Iran and for a deal to include maximum amount of Iranian oil coming to the market than a constrained version. So basically now, if I want to keep the timing of everything the same in terms of a deal being reached and the deal including terms that would allow Iran only to come back basically to the market in a few months, then we're more looking at the dark blue line on this chart than the orange line for the base case. I want to say for those who are interested that despite all the talks about how quick Iran can bring its production back up, we estimate Iran to hold a significant amount of oil in stocks, both on land in Iran, on land in China, and on ships on the water, basically in ships on the water, which is a floating storage called in the oil industry. That amount is readily, especially those in China and on ships, are readily available to be placed in the market. And we assess those volumes to be in the order of 70 to 80 million barrels, which is also something that the West is considering, is as well aware of, and could work for a faster, basically a JCPOA success scenario, or a shorter period of kind of a threshold before they can export oil to the market. One very important point here is that Iran's oil is coming back to the market at the time that that the oil price is well above $100, and we forecast it could go even higher in a not so how should I say in a not so exaggerated situation. It can go up to $140, $150, but in a case that most or all of the Russian crude is sanctioned by major importers, especially Europeans, then we could see even $200 or more as a likely scenario. Now, let's just focus on what it is today, which is $120 or thereabout. And our forecast is basically almost $100, just below $100 for 2022 as an average. If we multiply that by different segments of Iran's energy sector, you see that for 2020, Iran's total energy exports revenue is forecast to exceed well above the 2017 and 2018 levels. which were basically no sanctions, and certainly approaching what they had basically in terms of revenue in 2011 before Obama sanctions. So it is going to be basically a very financially resourceful for Iran if all of our forecasts are made true. Now, one very short comment for a longer term, for those who are interested to know, Iran did indeed lose some of its crude oil production capacity in recent past because of lack of investment in upstream sector. We assess current production capacity, especially post 2018-19, to have dropped by about 100 to 200 barrels per day at around 3.7 million barrels per day total crude production. We think that decline may continue because it's not possible to quickly recover that capacity, and it needs an injection of funds into the upstream projects. But then eventually they can bring it back if, again, if we assume there is no sanctions coming back on Iran's oil sector. But in our forecast, it will never reach to levels that some of the previous administrations and oil ministers have been talking. We forecast a maximum of 5 million barrels per day in 2030s for Iran's crude oil production capacity, not production. But on the gas side, again, there is a problem that is emerging and is very well discussed within Iranian energy sector, and that's South Pars, the mother of Iran's gas supply, is basically facing pressure drops and potentially could see a plateau approaching its production soon, and then a declining production. So Iran needs significant amount of injection into its gas upstream sector also to develop new non-associated gas fields, a lot of them on the southern part of the country. With that, I want to end my presentation and give it back to Fatemeh, and I'm very happy to join the panel to answer a question from the audience.
Thank you very much, Iman. And now, we will receive, questions from the audience, please. This was very interesting.
Thanks very much. So there are a number of questions in the Q&A box. If you don't mind, I'm going to promote you, and if you do mind, just don't accept to be promoted to ask the question, if that's okay. So I don't know if Rachel is okay to ask her question live. So, but I promote you to see if you're willing to, if you dare.
I'm happy to take Layli's question, and then obviously Esfandiar and Jawad are welcome to make their comments. But we see Russia's insisting on this, ensuring the inclusion of trade with Iran into the JCPOA conversation, because they want to make this process slower and potentially even not so unhappy if they see it fail. Russia has gone so far that there is no return in the policy they have taken, and they have counted on Europe's strong reliance on imports of oil and gas from Russia. Russia exports around 7 million barrels per day of oil and 170, 180 BCM of gas to Europe. That is not something that is easily replaceable, especially when it comes to gas. It's really hard to find ways around it. But on the oil side, an Iran return to the market will remove again the pressure from Russian oil. So I want to say that absolutely it's not really a concern for Russia to retain their general trade or trade with Iran. It's more of a handle of pressure on their agenda, political agenda.
Hello.
I don't know if the Fatih, I don't know whether Jawad and Yar also saw ladies.
Sorry, I somehow got out of the Zoom meeting. I don't know how to get back.
No, you're here.
Yeah, but I don't see myself or I don't see the questions. Sorry.
Don't worry, I've got Masood and Nader here, but first we were, I think, covering ladies' question.
I'll pass.
You
I don't have anything really to say more than people know.
Brilliant.
I think Iman's explanation was right on.
Okay, so and I've also Masood, and then Nader is also here.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, the panel, for a very informative and interesting presentations. I have a question which relates to both Jawad and Esfandiar's presentation. You both argue that because of the devaluations, manufacturing sector has had a positive growth, and that's the reason why employment in manufacturing is growing. Well, first of all, I mean, on theoretical side, this is not necessarily.
Meeting is being recorded. Meeting is being recorded. Meeting is being recorded.
Because Iran, well, a lot of the raw materials and inputs and investment goods in manufacturing are imported, and they would have higher prices after devaluations. And actually, I'm surprised that you don't look at the actual data on the growth of manufacturing. So if you take the data, we have quarterly data from the Markaz Amar between 2017 and end of 2020, I think, there is a decline in manufacturing output growth by about 10%. So, yeah, this may be wrong or over-exaggerated, but this doesn't show the positive growth that you're saying. So now, how do we explain then the positive employment growth? And I think that could be the reason for that, which you should take into account, is the really drastic fall in real wages. And there is probably a lot of substitution effect and a lot of employment growth because of lower wages. So I just want to put this question to you in this way. Thank you.
So do you want me to take that up, Fatih John? Okay, let me do that. That's a very good question, Masood John. I did not actually say that manufacturing value added has grown. You're right, it has declined. I was looking at employment as a way of showing what might happen if this change in relative prices becomes more permanent. And a lot of this has to do with time. Yes, in the short run, the manufacturing is caught between a good thing, which is higher profit rates, if they can get the inputs. And the price of the inputs have gone up, but there's no question that on balance, when you have real depreciation, that manufacturing will come ahead. Now, of course, employment is increasing slightly because real wages are lower, but that is the whole point. Because when oil exports cease, living standards fall and real wages are lower, hence the increased competitiveness of manufacturing. So I would expect that if these relative prices hold, and that's a kind of not a small if, because of Iran's political economy, the desire for low exchange rate, lower import prices, travel abroad, and all sorts of things. But if they do hold with time, and especially if there is a partial easing of sanctions, the import of intermediate goods, capital goods will ease, will help manufacturers take advantage of the improved profitability in the sector. So that's basically the message in terms of reverse Dutch disease, not that it has actually happened in the last several years.
Sorry, but can I just get in? So you argue that the lower real wages are necessary to be continued in the future if you want to have a manufacturing growth after the sanctions are moved, because we know that with the increased oil revenues and government expenditure, wages would go up, so it will counter the...
Yeah, these are lower real wages in terms of dollars, right? So Iranian workers are very cheap if they produce something and sell abroad. That doesn't necessarily mean that internally living standards have to stay low. All that's happening is that in terms of the exchange rate, the gap between the living standards and the productivity is becoming narrower. So if you have high wages that are being supported by imports or by the oil rent, your production is not competitive. And that's, I guess, the story of the Dutch disease. So when the reverse happens, you expect that Iranian workers are becoming more competitive, and therefore Iran should be able to export. Of course, right now it cannot export because of the financial sanctions, because of other sanctions. So that's why I think at this juncture, if Iran were able to remove the financial sanctions, it would do better than if it removes the oil sanctions.
Okay, thank you. No, I agree on that. I mean, basically, I just wanted to bring in the wage effect, really in creating employment in recent few years, in the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this very interesting session. I learned a lot. I just wanted to ask, I mean, energy subsidies are one of the sort of like the, I can't even say Achilles heel, but sort of like this ball of chain that is hanging on the Iranian, on the legs of the Iranian economy. And it has been said, and many, I mean, I'm sure that you are very, very familiar with the fact that the Iranian manufacturing industry or the industrial sector depends a lot on these hidden subsidies, on these implicit energy subsidies. And if they were to be reformed, would that essentially eliminate a large part, I don't want to say all, but a large part of the competitiveness of the Iranian non-oil exports? And if not, if we cannot sort of like come together, or at least if the Iranian policymakers cannot come together to improve or reform these energy policies, isn't Iran effectively exporting energy through the non-oil exports? Because without its cheap energy, it would really not be as competitive. Even with a very devalued exchange rate, it would still perhaps not be as competitive as we would like it to be. So that's my question, is like, what is your view? And, you know, given the fact that we really now more and more depend on the non-oil sector for generation of jobs, how likely would you think, this is my question is to all three panelists, how likely do you think we would ever be able to have a energy policy reform? Because in one way or the other, it is really distorting all prices around, across the economy. So that's my first question. And my second question, if I could ask a second question, Kamya John, it's to Jawad, I always mix you two brothers, but nonetheless, both of you have written extensively on gender issues and women's employment. And sorry, to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And of course, since you and I work on these issues on an extensive basis, I wanted to ask a question. You say that there has been an increase in the manufacturing sector's job availability or jobs, but Iranian women, I mean, I looked at these statistics about a year ago. There has been a vast decline of women's employment in the manufacturing sector. They lost, according to the data of last Iranian year, Iranian women lost about 250,000 jobs in the industrial sector, whereas men gained an almost equivalent number of jobs in the industrial sector. So I just want to ask, why is it so? If low wages are important, women are definitely getting less paid than men in terms of wage rates, or there's a big wage gap. Why is it that we see when this sector is growing and when there are jobs being added, that there is such a big disparity between job gains by gender? So this is to Jawad, and thank you very, very much for this very informative session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. It's okay, Fatih, if I pick up first, and maybe Yar wants to say something about the topic as well. In terms of your first question, which has to do with energy price reform. Well, that is one of the biggest challenges that Iran is facing in trying to create what you might call a normal economy, where workers' wages are based on the productivity, and that they're not, as you said, I think it's correct, that they're exporting energy by exporting manufactured or various things. Certainly export of petrochemicals is export of subsidized energy. But what needs to happen is there's going to be has to be a hierarchy of the reforms they want to do. I think the exchange reform or keeping the exchange rate at a reasonable level, so it's not reflecting the abundance of foreign exchange. Iran could easily expect $100 billion coming in the next year or so if JCPOA is resolved. That could do a number to this structural adjustment or resistance economy that people are talking about. That's the first priority, I think. The second has to be energy price reform. Energy price reform is much more important for the government, or from the point of view of government budget, than for the point of view of the economy. So first and foremost, I think Raisi's government is in need of generating revenue for all the ambitious projects it has. And the easiest way and the most economical, efficient way is to not only raise energy prices to their world level, but also to tax it. All countries tax energy. Part of it is a Pigovian tax, to improve efficiency. But Iran does not earn anything from the about 5 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent per day that it sells domestically. So that has to come, but it is all going to have to go slowly, but surely, to bring Iran to a more sustainable level, if you like. And your second question, can you remind me quickly, Nader, what was your second question? I'm getting too old now.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's essentially, you said that they have been
women.
Good
Yes.
job. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. No, very good. I should have guessed that you would ask that very important question. You're right. I think women have suffered lately, but I am not sure if that's the sanctions or COVID. Here we have a real identification problem. If you look at data carefully, most of the decline in women's employment in all sectors, it's coming after COVID. And that is a pattern that has been observed throughout the world. because schools are kind of closed and women have more responsibility at home. So with COVID, they are more likely to quit their jobs, and for men maybe to pick up some of the slack. Hopefully that if it is COVID, it doesn't become a long-term problem. Although Iran does have a long-term problem in that women are 1/4 as likely to be employed as men. But we will see how that goes.
So,
Thank you very much.
Maybe if I could just quickly comment on, I think Nader's excellent question about the idea that, Iran is basically exporting energy even when it's exporting non-oil goods. There's a couple things that I would sort of raise here, and I don't have a really definitive answer on this question, but there are a couple things that come to mind. One is that, I should emphasize that I think the adjustment that Javad and I are talking about in terms of Iranian manufacturers not necessarily achieving the same kind of growth that they would have achieved in a normal circumstance, but at least showing some resilience by finding new export opportunities for non-oil goods. That is something that we see more in light manufacturing than in heavy manufacturing. And so I think that basically it's less energy intensive. So we're talking about consumer goods being shipped to the Iraqi market, like food products or detergents and shampoos, which are a little bit different than, for example, Iran's automotive production or its steel production that would require more of those resources. So that may be one sort of mitigating factor here. And then the other thing I would point out is just that the competitiveness of Iran's non-oil goods in global markets, price competitiveness, if there is an energy subsidy reform, depends on the relative price of energy in Iran and other countries. And arguably, energy in Iran is so cheap right now that the government could stand to kind of reduce some of those subsidies, perhaps targeting certain kinds of enterprises or certain kinds of production first, without substantially changing where Iran is relative to other countries in terms of the ability to produce goods inexpensively. So, I think there is probably room from a policy standpoint for those reforms to be pursued. And I guess the argument is that while that reform might be untenable in this current environment where there's a sort of outsized dependence on the manufacturing sector, it's possible that in an environment where you have, let's say, the additional kind of resources of the government available because of sanctions relief and other kinds of growth taking place in the economy, that it might be easier to do those things. But it's interesting for me that different kinds of subsidy reform are still on Raisi's agenda in the new budget, principally in the currency markets. So there does seem to be some appetite to look at these complicated questions that will ultimately make things, quote unquote, more expensive in Iran.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think you're on mute, but Hamid has a question as well.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Salam, everyone. Hello, Fatemeh, after many years. Hello, Fatemeh June. I haven't seen you for a while. Salam, Javad, Iman, and Isfandiar. Excellent talk. Really enjoyed it. And a couple of questions. The first one for Javad and the second one for Isfandiar. Javad, one thing that I noticed from your last graph, the last figure before the end of the conversation, the end of the presentation, was one in which the service sector is actually better than the manufacturing sector. And I wanted you to comment on that, because here's the thing. If in fact we're thinking about the devaluation in being the primary driver for the manufacturing sort of rebound or resilience, if you will, then we have to have a kind of an explanation why the services are doing as well as they are doing. Because as we know, it's mostly the non-traded sector that, that are in the services. So I think it's a bit of an explanation of that, because we don't, unless we're somehow thinking of a kind of factual in which the manufacturing would have done worse and then it's doing better. That kind of would be, I guess, the framing of why manufacturing is critical. But the way that I perhaps that is what's going on. But when I looked at the figure that you presented, I was left a bit with that puzzle. So that's the question I have for Javad, and I have a sort of much shorter and quicker question for Esfandiar. Should I wait for the answer and then go to my second question, Kamil Jun or Fatemeh Jun? What should I do?
Why don't you ask both questions?
Okay, the question for Esfandiar is this notion of the raw material bottleneck that you pointed to as potential challenge for the manufacturing sector. I wanted to learn a bit more about that. Is that a balance of payments question? That is, you have to pay for your imports by your export revenue, or is that, what's the source of that bottleneck? Perhaps you could enlighten us a little bit more on that. Thank you both very much. And I'm going to put myself on mute so I can hear you better.
Okay, maybe I'll quickly answer the question that Hamid asked. You're right that services has done relatively okay, similar to manufacturing. I'm not sure if it did better than manufacturing, especially once COVID came. You could see at the very last year of the graph that services declined, employment in services declined. But the major point is that services in Iran is really a residual category. People are more easily identified with a real job in manufacturing or agriculture. And if they lose those jobs, they go join their father's grocery store or sit around a real estate agency just so they're not home. If you pass this real estate agency offices, you'll see like a dozen young men sitting talking to each other. They would probably respond to a questionnaire of a statistical center that they're employed in services. So I wouldn't take the services sector, the employment data, all that seriously. But
does that, if I may just follow up on that, does that mean what typically we think about the informal sector in the developing country would also fall into that service sector that you
yeah, absolutely. I think informality is much more prevalent in the service sector than in industry or agriculture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Esfandiar, do you want me to repeat my question, or is it about the import bottle, the raw material?
Yes, of course. Bottle. Okay. So I think I'll give an example of one of these bottlenecks. So I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a balance of payments problem, because, Iran's problem is not necessarily that it faces this kind of balance of payments crisis from sanctions. It has ample reserves, and even if there was this problem, it could have tapped into those reserves in a normal situation to finance those deficits. But what we find is it's more of an accessibility of foreign exchange problem. So the issue that Iran faces is that Iranian importers face delays in making payments in a timely and reliable fashion to their suppliers, because they struggle to get allocations of currency from the Central Bank of Iran. This has gotten a little bit better with the implementation of the NEMA market, which is a parallel market for exporters and importers. But even if that foreign currency allocation is made to the bank account of an Iranian importer, the payment delay is often then basically finding a viable banking channel so that the Iranian, the origin bank can then make a payment to the beneficiary bank of the supplier. And so to give a concrete example, we see this a lot in Iran's imports, even of basic foodstuffs that are technically meant to be exempt from sanctions. And for example, one of the reasons why the price of poultry, eggs, and meat in Iran has increased so much is that the price of animal feed has increased because animal feed manufacturers in Iran are facing difficulties in securing enough supply of soy meal, which is an important ingredient in the animal feed. That soy meal typically comes from Brazil and Argentina. It's typically bought from a handful of large traders, but the bottleneck emerges both on the payment side and then also on the logistics side, finding companies that are willing to transport the goods to Iran. And this is in a sector where, technically speaking, this trade is exempted from sanctions, but we still see these problems. So you can imagine if we're talking about sort of more purely like industrial goods, things like, you know, if a company needs to buy some kind of part for a furnace or an oven that it uses as part of a manufacturing process, and that part is produced by a couple producers in Germany, maybe one in China, it can be very difficult to secure these things. So generally speaking, I mean, it's not a matter of Iran being unable to afford these things. Obviously, Iran has money. It's more the accessibility of those funds, specifically the foreign exchange reserves, the ability to make payments using those funds. And then even when the payments channel is viable, there's a logistics bottleneck as well. And the companies that solve all of these problems, and many do, which is why the manufacturing sector is still running, they solve them at greater expense. They're basically higher transaction costs all across the supply chain, and then those costs are getting passed on to consumers.
Okay, thank you. Excellent answer, both of you. Thank you so much.
I think Hashem is next.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I learned a lot as usual. I'm really concerned, I think, because if I listen to you guys and then say, okay, there could be a relaxation of sanction, Iran become a wonderful country, the economy would function, the people get better, and all the problems Iran has having the last 40 years of sanction go away. And then comparison Iran with Russia in a state of the war, the sanctions are imposed just the last few weeks. Iran have been sanctioned 40 years of adjustment. I got a bit worried. So I thought, okay, what about the people who think what we are saying today? You know, for example, people ask Fatemeh, there was ask from you guys that what about employment of women? So it's with COVID, but then we look at the data before COVID. That's wrong to look at COVID period at all. I mean, it's very easy. Just look at the data before COVID. So why do you answer that, oh, it's because of COVID? It seems to me this is, in my view, while I understand some of the defensive mechanism people have, but I think the data quite speak very well. There's a lot of mismanagement. It's not just because of, if you like, in my opinion, the usual, what we call facade, or basically the usual thing which is afflict most of developing countries. I mean, Iran is one of the developing countries. So I was wanting to hear more about the management of the economy, not so much micromanagement of the economy. The inflation wasn't mentioned. It's been running at 40%, and it's been endemic. And then with the, I think Masood works on this problem also about minimum wages, which every year has been rising, and that become like a indexation. And so there are a lot of issues. The monetary system, the banking sectors, all of the hierarchical structure of decision making. I think we should really admit those, because if we don't discuss those, we think, oh, the sanction is removed, everything back to normal. Yes, oil price has gone up $200 temporarily. That would be great. But then what happens? All these petrodollars coming to Iran. And then you start having all the usual problem that we have this volatility. There is no management of the petrodollar entering the country at the moment. There is no real stabilization fund or any of those mechanism institutions which protect the economy from these shocks that are going to be more likely. So I was just at a balance raising these issues. What I understand, Iran has withstood the sanction very well and still functioning, and the political end of those who impose sanction hasn't been met, but that's it. The rest of it is still asked with the Iranian to look at honestly what has been the effect of sanctions, or like what's likely if these sanctions are removed. Otherwise, other thing you remember, removal of sanctions doesn't mean there is no threat of future sanctions, or no new threat of other opposition against Iran. We saw what happened with Trump. We know the American Congress is not going to approve this. It's not going to be taken to the Congress to approve it. So let's just be a little bit more honest about what this means for Iran and Iranians, as some of them may be listening to us. Sorry about this.
May I respond, Kamir Jan? So,
Please.
I mean, yeah. Hashem Jan, I think, that's obviously a really important sort of point to introduce balance into the way that we're approaching this. But I want to point to something that I said at the beginning of my presentation, which was to question the idea that any resilience that we see in the Iranian economy is evidence of policy success. And actually, I think what's interesting about the analysis, at least that I've come up with on the trade side, is that there's very little to suggest that the resilience is a product of Iranian economic management or policymaking. And my sense is that actually a lot of the government sloganeering around its resistance and its movements in response to sanctions were just taking credit for things that were decisions made at the household and business level about how you survive in a really difficult environment. And so when I look at a scenario like the lifting of sanctions, the reason why I think it's okay to have a reasonably optimistic outlook, given the fact that we know that there's endemic corruption, mismanagement, weak monetary and fiscal policy, all sorts of problems that, as you say, are similar to what we see in peer countries for Iran, is that the experience under sanctions gives us no greater confidence in the policymaking ability of the Iranian government, but it should give us greater confidence in just the fundamental kind of decision-making, management capacity, and resource allocation of households and businesses that responded to a shock with what I think was a surprising level of coherent thinking about how they would try and survive in a really difficult situation. So, that's kind of where I'm coming from. If there are sort of people in Iran listening in on the call, I think they deserve a lot of praise for having gone through an incredibly difficult period. And of course, not everyone was able to demonstrate resilience. Companies went bankrupt, households fell into poverty. But nonetheless, in the aggregate, I think what we should sort of take away from this is that within kind of the business community and the social fabric of Iran, we are probably further along in some important aspects of development that we may be appreciated. And that's what compensated for the lack of astute policymaking by the government in that period.
But why, if that's the case, why underestimate the importance of services? Service sector employs more than manufacturing. Service sector is the one with the IT, all the young people come in and created all these startup companies. Yeah. But then when I hear the focus is manufacturing, 13% of the market, and they are doing well because the exchange rate is in favor of them.
I think
so. You see, the argument doesn't fit together.
The focus on manufacturing is because it's a source of foreign exchange revenue, and that's really the key thing for a country that's experiencing sanctions. The impact of sanctions is to diminish foreign exchange revenue. The manufacturing sector was able to compensate for that. And ultimately, the services sector, which depends on kind of the domestic consumption, Iran doesn't export a lot of services, is something that, it wouldn't be able to persist, I think, in my view, in the way that it has, had it not been for this kind of important resilience that we saw in manufacturing.
May I jump in? Yeah, I don't know where to begin. I think Hashem is correct that many things are wrong, and I don't think we created the impression that everything is rosy. There is no question that when you have a big negative shock, you see GDP falling, you see living standards falling, and that cannot be rosy. I also mentioned how difficult it is in terms of political economy for Iran to maintain the kind of exchange rate that it has now, the real exchange rate, so things may go downhill there. Energy subsidy reform is a formidable task. They're trying to do something about it. I'm not sure they will manage. So the problems are abound. And women's employment is one of them. I did say that women are 1/4 as likely to be employed as men. But if you look at the number of women employed over the last few years, you see the hit coming with COVID. I didn't say COVID explains why women are underemployed or employed less than men. Who would say that? So the point of the talk is really to create balance, not vis-a-vis Iran the Great and how things are bad, but vis-a-vis you put sanctions, Iran's economy collapses, and US will have its way. If there's anything that is, at least my work shows, is that US is waging a war against ordinary people for an unattainable goal. That's the point of this. The point of this talk was not about how bad Iran's economy is run. That's another panel, another talk, why women are underemployed, why there's corruption, why there is the wrong kind of incentives, relative prices that you have mentioned as well. So let's put another panel, maybe talk about that, but let's not try to lose the focus of this panel, which is really relative to the goals of sanctioneers as opposed to a kind of a nirvana economy for Iran. No, Iran is not going to recover in 10 years. When you lose over $2 trillion of GDP because of sanctions, you don't recover. Maybe you never recover. Maybe your growth path in future will always be below what it would have been for ad infinitum. So there's a lot of tragedy here to emphasize, but that wasn't really the point of the seminars or this panel, I thought. So I hope the recording that's available will show that.
May I make a comment here?
Mahmoud has a question as well. I don't know if you want to jump in.
Is my turn, Kamyar?
Go for it. You've been waiting for a long time.
You want to come in now, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to follow up on Hashem's point about domestic policy, but it's a different thing. Thank you very much, by the way, to Javad and all the presenters for very interesting and illuminating papers. But Dr. Salih Esfahani said that about the impact of sanctions on poverty and inequality. And the poverty has gone up and inequality has gone up as well. But we should not forget that poverty and inequality are the result of distributional issues domestically and not necessarily directly. I mean, indirectly, they are related to sanctions because resources are lower. But the point is that domestic policy has not tried to neutralize the impact of sanctions on the poor, on the middle classes, and also on other sectors of the population. That is the very important point to remember. The high inflation that has resulted in Iran, partly due to devaluation, the depreciation of the dollars, and other factors is not the direct result of sanctions, but poor domestic policy, especially on the mass increase, on the increase of liquidity internally, and that has affected the poor more than any other sectors. So we should not put all the eggs on the in the basket of sanctions. The cash transfer, which used to be $10 when it was introduced, now it is perhaps around $2, and this purchasing power has declined dramatically. So these are domestic policies and not the result of sanctions, because during the war with Iraq, despite the destruction of the economy, which is, it might be far less than the effect of sanctions, the inequality did not increase, and poverty and hunger didn't increase, partly because of the government neutralizing the impact of the war through a mass distribution policy and through a lot of other control policies. So we have to pay attention to this. The corruption and the rent seeking, etc., is not going to go away when the sanctions are removed or they decline. The other point I have here is to do with the impact on the middle classes. I agree with you that the middle classes have not been, maybe they have become a bit poorer, but the middle concept of middle class is beyond the economic factors, and you have education, you have access to resources, etc., that the lower classes don't have. But the psychological impact of this increase in poverty and lack of hope inside Iran has resulted in either desire or actual migration of a lot of skilled people who come from the middle classes, by the way. And also flight of capital in the recent, the past couple of years, especially to Turkey. When the lira dropped against the dollar, there has been a lot of migration of people, middle classes especially, going to Turkey and buying either first or second houses. Most of them buying first houses even, in order to create a space for their children to go to Turkey. Iran, I think, is a second the largest purchaser of housing in Turkey at the moment. So we should not ignore the psychological impact of the pressure of sanctions and internal policy, by the way, on the large sector of the population, which has a lot of economic consequences. So I'm not just talking about the politics of it, but the economic consequences of state policy. The final point I have is this, that the Russian economy is far more resilient than Iranian economy. I mean, a country which, combined with Ukraine, exports, provides 30% of the world grains, plus 40% of gas to Europe, plus nearly 8 million barrels a day, etc., is far different from Iran. The second point is the composition of output. China is probably, Russia probably second or third largest exporter of arms. So this manufacturing sector Russia has is far more advanced than what Iran has in any shape or form. So that gives it much more resilience, but we should not ignore the fact that over time, the growth path of Russia will be hammered because of the sanctions. And that, I think, is an important lesson from the impact of the sanction on all the countries that we know of, and without any impact on the regime and any regime change, so to speak. Thanks a lot.
Fatih, should I take that? Okay, so those are all very interesting points. I want to start with, you said that they're not able to protect the living standards, especially of the poor. You're absolutely right. Well, why cannot they? Why can't they? Because of sanctions. Sanctions have taken a large chunk of government revenue out, and so those programs that like Ahmadinejad had, distributing a lot of cash, that's not affordable anymore unless they do energy price reform, which they can, but it's very difficult. So I wouldn't say that they don't want to protect the poor, but they just don't have the money. If they start spending money on the poor, inflation is going to pick up again. And as Hashem said, it's very, very high already. And another point you mentioned, kind of related to this, was that they did better during the war. Absolutely not. I don't know where you get your numbers. Poverty rates were 40% during the war. Now they are about 15% with the same poverty line. There is no way that you can compare living standards now with the war. And I hope people realize that and don't push the government to bring the kind of policies there that kind of protected the poor, which was rationing. We don't need rationing now. We need price reform. We need better access to global markets and so on. And you will see, I mean, this is something that the future can reveal. If JCPOA is revived, you will see over the next few years, just like when you saw in 2016, when the economy grew by 13% and 7% the following year, that the economy starts growing. Nothing reduces poverty like economic growth. The government is also going to have more money, and it will probably start spending on the poor. Inequality is a different issue than poverty. Iranian government, as I've written about and said many times, is good in poverty reduction, but it is kind of clueless when it comes to what generates inequality. It's a complex market, semi-market economy with a lot of very strange crony capitalists and so on. So we don't know when the oil money comes, whether it's going to get stuck at the higher echelons of power or whether it's going to quickly trickle down to the bottom. So it's quite likely that inequality will rise even when the oil money is coming. You have seen that in the past when inequality, when there is higher oil prices, inequality rises. But my focus here was more on poverty, really. And I think the rise in poverty is directly because of sanctions. It is incumbent upon those who want to bring corruption and mismanagement, which abound, to explain rising poverty. Show me how corruption explains rising poverty. Show me how mismanagement has become worse since 2010. I hope you take those graphs of GDP seriously and start thinking about what happened in 2010, 2011 that stopped 20 years of economic growth in Iran. Thank you.
Will I come in just quickly, Javier?
Mahmoud, can I just pass, because Varzin has been waiting for a long time as well. Unless
Okay.
Yar wants to, or Iman wants to jump in.
Okay, that's fine, that's fine.
Okay. Varzin, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks to panelists. And Professor Saleh Isfahani wrote me a short answer to my question, but I want to elaborate on my question a little bit. And I want to just quickly mention that I was working on two sectors, and I have first-hand information from my field study in garment industry and home appliance that in the recent 2-3 years, really things got changed. So there is a boom in manufacturing sector, especially in labor-intensive sector like garments and apparel industry. So I know that from the first hand. And if you go to the market, you see that the pattern of the products that are presented in the stores are different now. You see more Iranian products. And my question was for Professor Saleh Isfahani, and that was, I'm worried about the lifting the sanctions and the Iranian government and even private sector got access to the foreign currency, and the flow of the foreign exchange coming to the economy, and it could be harmful to the manufacturing sector, that it just got the way it is right now. And I'm wondering, what policy advice do you have for the government or for the policymakers to manage the effects? Do you think we have to control the trade or the currency, and whatever I'm just wondering what's your thoughts on? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I like the little information you injected into this about appliances and so on. I've also read anecdotes of how the shoe industry, textiles are picking up. Hopefully we'll have more detailed data on those in the future. But in terms of giving policy advice, I am not really in a good position to say a whole lot. I would say that making sure that the dollars that are flowing in do not become imported goods that send a lot of these new firms. And I like also, let me say, what you said about lower skilled workers, because that's really the crux of the recovery. The kind of recovery I would like is to hire high school graduates. Yes, IT is very important, it's doing very well, but nobody's really terribly worried about these geniuses graduating from Sharif University not being able to survive under sanctions. The trick is to get high school graduates who can't afford to go to university or are unable to pass the concours to be able to get jobs. And I think manufacturing offers that much more likely than IT sector. It is a real challenge to take an economy that has been distorted so much over time and try to fix it. And one shouldn't become either too pessimistic to say that, for two, nothing can be done about it, and not too optimistic to say that we can solve all the problems and give people hope that there's going to be this and that happening. I know the temptation is great. When there are dollars, people want to travel abroad. When Rouhani was in power, first thing they did when they got the JCPOA approved was to buy or try to buy 200 planes. And I'm hoping that that's not the priority right now. The priority will be to make sure a guy standing in some crossroad in a village or a small city, doing nothing but being except being in the service sector, is that they get real jobs that pay, jobs that engage them, jobs that teach them, help them make a family, and so on. That's the future of Iran. If I had the answers to those things, I'd be, I guess, a rich man. But I don't. And it just requires a lot of good thinking, a lot of economists, a lot of policymakers. But above all, it requires access to the global markets. There is not much hope to continue with, resisting sanctions ad infinitum. I really think that you cannot do more than 3 to 4% growth rates without access to foreign markets. I'm not talking about just oil. I'm talking about small and medium enterprises being able to sell their stuff abroad. Domestic market is probably not able to absorb increased production. The economy is depressed. So you need Iran's neighbors, maybe wider set of countries to import from Iran to help create jobs for men, for women, more or less educated. We have passed the 2 hours deadline. Kamia, are you still there?
I'm there. I'm here. I'm taking lots of notes. You can see me typing. I think you're right. We passed lots of questions have been answered live. By the way, if you haven't noticed it, you can see it, everybody, in the Q&A box where you basically see the answers to the questions that the participants have given. But if there are any other questions, I'm sure you can reach out. Is that all right if people reach out to you and ask you both on the report or anything else that you mentioned? Iman, thanks so much for answering lots of questions on the oil and gas markets in the Q&A box. But with that, may I just say, I think Fatih, I think you were not able to unmute for some reason. I apologize. It might be something on our end. But just to say thank you so much to all the panelists for being, giving up your time and your views and sharing your results. Thank you so much, and to all the participants who stayed with us for the full 2 hours. They seem to be getting longer every time, which I suppose is good. Our next session is on transition to a low carbon economy, and which is organized by Hamed, who's one of our board members, and together with we have people from Oxford, Bassam Fatou, we have Iman Nasseri, who people know, and we have Laila Shiva, who will join us then. So I hope you join us in 4 weeks' time. I think it's 13th of April. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, good morning, and good night, wherever you are.
Goodbye.